Something's happening to you that makes no sense. You've been called sensitive your entire life, told you feel too much, care too deeply, absorb everything around you like a sponge. And for years, you wore this as identity, the empath, the one who understands, the one who holds space for everyone's pain. But now, something has shifted. The gift that defined you has become a curse. You can't escape. You're drowning in other people's emotions, suffocating under the weight of energies that aren't even yours. And the darkness, closing in around you, isn't ordinary depression or burnout. It's something far more profound, far more destabilizing. Something Carl Jung identified as the necessary descent that precedes true transformation. What you're experiencing isn't random suffering. It's not evidence that you're broken or that your empathic nature has finally destroyed you. What's happening is a specific, documented phase that Jung called the dark night of the soul. And for empaths, this darkness manifests in ways that are uniquely devastating. Today I'm going to reveal why chosen empaths must pass through this darkness. What Jung's concept of individuation explains about why your empathic gifts are currently destroying you, why the darkness gets worse before it transforms, and what waits on the other side if you can survive the descent without losing yourself completely. Jung's understanding of the dark night began with a pattern he observed across decades of psychological work. Certain individuals, particularly those with heightened sensitivity to the emotional and psychic states of others, would reach a point where their gift became their prison. These were people who had spent their entire lives being what Jung called psychologically porous, open to everyone, absorbing everything, carrying the emotional weight of families, communities, entire social systems without even realizing they were doing it. And Jung noticed something crucial. These individuals would hit a breaking point, not gradually, suddenly, like their entire system had overloaded and shut down all at once. They would describe feeling like they were dying, not physically, but psychologically, like some essential part of them was being torn apart. And they would come to Jung, terrified, convinced they were having a breakdown, worried they were losing their minds, desperate to understand why the empathic abilities that had always worked were now destroying them from the inside out. But Jung saw something his patients couldn't see. They weren't breaking down, they were breaking open. What they were experiencing was what he documented as the dark night of transformation. The psychological death that must occur before genuine rebirth becomes possible. And for empaths, this dark night had a specific architecture, a particular set of mechanisms that made it more brutal, more isolating, more absolute than the transformation others experienced. What Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, separate from the collective, requires a kind of death, the death of the false self, the constructed identity, the persona you've been performing to survive in the world. And for empaths, that false self is built entirely on their capacity to absorb, to merge, to dissolve their boundaries in service of everyone around them. Here's what actually triggers the dark night for chosen empaths. You reach a threshold, not one you chose, not one you can control, but a threshold your psyche determines you've crossed. You've absorbed too much for too long, carried too many people's pain, too many people's traumas, too many people's unprocessed emotions. And your system, your consciousness, makes a decision without consulting you. It cannot continue this way. You will not survive if the absorption continues. So, it initiates what Jung would recognize as a forced individuation, a psychological emergency procedure where your consciousness attempts to separate you from everyone you've been merged with, even though that separation feels like death. The dark night begins with what feels like your empathic abilities intensifying to an unbearable degree. Suddenly, you're not just feeling other people's emotions. You're being flooded by them, overwhelmed by them, drowned in a tsunami of emotional and energetic input that you can no longer process or contain. You walk into a room and you're immediately crushed by the weight of everyone's unspoken pain. You talk to a friend and you're pulled into their depression so completely you can't find your way back out. You scroll through social media and you absorb the collective anxiety, the rage, the grief, the chaos, until you feel like you're being torn apart by forces you can't see and can't escape. And this intensification isn't your empathy getting stronger, it's your boundaries completely collapsing. What Jung understood as the dissolution phase of transformation, where the old structure, the old way of being, has to break down completely before something new can form. For empaths, those boundaries were already thin, already porous, but now they're gone entirely. And without boundaries, you're just raw consciousness being bombarded by every emotional frequency around you, with no protection, no filter, no way to distinguish what's yours from what you're absorbing from the collective field. Jung documented 3 specific mechanisms that create the dark night for empaths. Understanding these mechanisms is crucial because without this understanding, you'll interpret the darkness as permanent damage when it's actually temporary destruction in service of rebirth. The first mechanism is psychic flooding. Your system is being deliberately overwhelmed, not by accident, not because something's wrong with you, but because your consciousness has determined that the only way to make you stop absorbing is to make absorption so painful you can't continue it. Think about it. For your entire life, absorption has been your primary way of relating to others. It's how you've created connection, how you've felt close to people, how you've known you matter. Taking on other people's pain has been your value, your purpose, your identity, and your consciousness knows that you won't stop voluntarily. You can't stop, because stopping would mean losing your sense of who you are, losing your way of connecting, losing your reason for existing. So it makes absorption unbearable. It removes whatever protective mechanisms were allowing you to absorb without being completely destroyed. And suddenly, every act of empathy feels like you're being ripped apart. Every time you take on someone else's emotion, it doesn't just blend with yours anymore. It overtakes you completely, possesses you. And you realize with growing horror that you can't tell anymore where other people end and you begin. Can't distinguish your own feelings from the feelings you've absorbed from everyone around you. Can't find yourself in the chaos of everyone else's emotional debris that's accumulated in your consciousness over years, over decades, over your entire life. The flooding forces you to confront something you've been avoiding. You don't actually know who you are, because almost everything you think of as you is actually absorbed material. Collected emotions, inherited beliefs, borrowed identities that you've been carrying as your own. And underneath all that absorption, there might be nothing, just emptiness, just void. And that possibility is terrifying enough to make you want to claw your way back to the old way of being, even if the old way is now destroying you. The second mechanism is what Jung called the shadow confrontation. In the darkness, when you're too overwhelmed to keep absorbing from others, you finally have to face what you've been absorbing. And here's what most empaths don't understand. When you absorb someone's emotion, when you take on their pain, it doesn't just pass through you, it stays in you, accumulates in your unconscious, becomes part of your shadow material. All the rage you've absorbed from people who couldn't express it, all the grief you've carried for people who couldn't cry, all the shame you've taken on from people who couldn't face it, all the fear, the anxiety, the despair you've been holding for everyone who needed you to be their emotional container. It's all still there, buried in your psyche. And in the dark night, it surfaces, not gradually, all at once, like a dam breaking. And suddenly, You're flooded with emotions that feel like yours but aren't yours. Rage that doesn't match anything in your life. Depression that has no clear source. Anxiety that seems to come from nowhere. And you can't tell what's authentically your emotion and what's the accumulated shadow material you've absorbed from everyone you've ever merged with. Jung emphasized that this shadow confrontation is necessary, that you cannot individuate, cannot become who you actually are, until you've faced and integrated what's been hidden in your unconscious. But for empaths, the shadow isn't just their own rejected material, it's everyone else's rejected material that they've been carrying. And confronting that weight, that darkness, that accumulated pain from dozens or hundreds of people is almost unbearable. It feels like you're being possessed by demons, like you're losing your mind, like the darkness is going to consume you completely. But Jung would tell you this: the darkness isn't consuming you. You're finally seeing what you've been carrying. And only by seeing it, by acknowledging its presence, can you begin to release it, to distinguish what's actually yours from what you absorbed, to reclaim your psychic space from all the emotional debris you've been storing for others. The third mechanism is ego death. Jung's work on individuation made clear that transformation requires the death of the ego structure you've been operating from. The constructed self, the identity you've built, the persona you've been performing. For empaths, that ego structure is built entirely on being needed, on being the one who understands, the one who helps, the one who absorbs everyone's pain so they don't have to feel it. Your entire sense of self is organized around this role, and in the dark night, that role stops working. People stop coming to you because you can't hold their emotions anymore. You're too flooded with your own darkness to absorb theirs, or you push them away because being around anyone feels like being crushed, like their presence is adding weight to a burden you can already barely carry. And as the connections fall away, as the role you've always played becomes impossible to maintain, your ego structure begins to collapse. Who are you if you're not the empath? Who are you if you're not the one who carries everyone's pain? Who are you if you can't help, can't fix, can't absorb? These questions create existential terror because you genuinely don't know the answer. Your identity has been so completely built on your empathic role that without it, there's nothing, just emptiness. Just the void of a self that never developed because you were too busy being absorbed into everyone else. And this ego death feels exactly like actual death, like you're disappearing, like you're being erased, like nothing will be left when this darkness finally finishes with you. But Jung's research showed that ego death isn't the end. It's the midpoint, the necessary dissolution that precedes reconstruction. You have to die as the absorbed empath before you can be born as your authentic self. And that authentic self cannot emerge while you're still merged with everyone around you, still playing the role that's kept you trapped, still avoiding the emptiness by filling it with everyone else's reality. Here's what actually happens in the depth of the dark night that makes it so necessary. In the darkness, in the isolation, in the absolute collapse of everything you've been, something starts to happen that couldn't happen any other way. Your authentic self begins to signal, not loudly, not obviously, but in quiet ways that only become perceptible when everything else has been stripped away. You notice a boundary emerging, not one you decided to create, not one you're enforcing through will, but a genuine, organic boundary that comes from your actual self rather than your constructed persona. And this boundary says no, not because you should say no, not because someone told you to have boundaries, but because your authentic self genuinely does not want to absorb this person's emotion, does not want to take on this responsibility, does not want to merge with this energy. And that no feels different than any no you've said before. It's not coming from anger or resentment. It's not a reaction against being taken advantage of. It's just a simple, clear statement of what's true for you. And it doesn't need explanation or justification. It just is. You notice preferences surfacing, small things, desires that are genuinely yours rather than absorbed from others. Maybe it's wanting to be alone when the old you would have forced yourself into social situations. Maybe it's feeling drawn to something that serves no purpose except your own interest. Maybe it's discovering you actually don't like something you've been pretending to like because everyone around you liked it. These small signals are your authentic self, emerging from underneath all the absorbed material. And they only become perceptible in the darkness, in the silence, where there's no one else's reality drowning out your own. You start to distinguish between your energy and others' energy, not conceptually, not through techniques or practices, but through direct perception that arises from the flooding and the shadow work. You can feel now when you're starting to absorb, can sense the exact moment when you begin to merge with someone else's emotional state. And you have a choice you never had before, to consciously not absorb, to stay separate, to witness their experience without making it your own. This capacity for conscious separation is what Jung meant by individuation. You're finally becoming an individual, separate, distinct, with your own emotional reality that's not contaminated by everyone else's. And this separation, which used to feel like loss of connection, now feels like liberation. Because you're discovering that real connection doesn't require merging, that you can be present with someone, can care about them, can understand them, without dissolving yourself into them. But here's where most empaths in the dark night make a fatal mistake. They meet their authentic self, feel these new boundaries and preferences emerging, and then they run. They get scared of who they're becoming, scared of losing people who only know how to relate to the absorbed version, scared of the life changes that honoring their authentic self would require. So they try to go back, try to resurrect the old empathic role, try to force themselves to absorb again, even though their system is screaming at them to stop. And every time they do this, every time they choose the false self over the authentic self, the dark night gets darker, the flooding intensifies, the shadow material becomes more overwhelming, the ego death becomes more complete. Because their consciousness is trying to make it impossible for them to return to the old way, trying to burn down the false identity so completely that there's nothing to go back to. So the only option is forward, through the darkness, into the unknown territory of who they actually are when they're not absorbed into everyone else. Jung documented that the length of the dark night varied wildly between individuals. Some moved through it in months, others stayed in it for years. It depended on how much absorbed material needed to be released, how deeply the authentic self had been buried, how resistant the person was to letting the false identity die. But the pattern was always the same: flooding, shadow confrontation, ego death, emergence of authentic self, choice to honor or betray that emerging self. The empaths who honored it, who chose to stay in the darkness until the transformation completed, they crossed a threshold Jung recognized as the point of individuation. They became separate, whole, with boundaries that protected rather than isolated, with empathy that perceived without absorbing, with the capacity to be present with others' pain without making it their own. They developed what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing realities simultaneously, to be deeply empathic and deeply boundaried at the same time, to care profoundly about others while caring equally about themselves. But the empaths who couldn't tolerate the darkness, who kept running back to the false self, they stayed trapped, kept cycling through periods of flooding and temporary relief, kept absorbing until they broke, then isolating, until they felt guilty enough to start absorbing again. And they'd spend years, sometimes decades, in this pattern, never completing the transformation, never becoming who they actually are underneath the absorbed identity, just trapped in the dark night, circling the same lessons, refusing to die completely enough to be reborn. Here's what Jung discovered about what waits on the other side of the dark night for empaths who complete the passage. They emerge as what he would recognize as individuated beings, whole, integrated, with their empathic gifts intact but transformed, no longer absorbing reflexively, no longer merging automatically, instead choosing consciously when and how to extend their sensitivity, using their empathy as a tool rather than being used by it as their only mode of relating. These transformed empaths develop what Jung called the authentic personality. They know who they are, separate from everyone else, know their own thoughts, feelings, desires, boundaries, not as concepts, but as lived reality. And this knowing creates a stability that wasn't possible when they were absorbed into everyone around them. They're no longer destabilized by other people's emotions, no longer pulled into other people's dramas, no longer responsible for other people's healing. They can be present with someone who's suffering without taking on the suffering, can witness someone's pain without making it their pain, can offer support without sacrificing themselves. And this creates a completely different kind of relationship, one where both people remain whole, where connection doesn't require dissolution, where love doesn't mean losing yourself. Jung emphasized that these transformed empaths often end up alone for a while, not because they're broken or damaged, but because most people can't relate to someone who won't absorb them anymore. Most relationships in the empath's life were built on the dynamic of the empath absorbing and the other person offloading. And when that dynamic becomes impossible, when the empath maintains their boundaries and refuses to merge, those relationships end, not dramatically, just quietly. They reveal themselves as having been built on nothing substantial, just mutual use disguised as connection. And the transformed empath has to rebuild their social world from scratch, has to find the rare others who've also done enough inner work that they don't need someone to absorb them. Who can meet another whole person without needing them to dissolve? These connections are rare. Jung documented that individuated empaths typically have 2 or 3 genuine relationships instead of the dozens of surface connections they had before. But those few relationships are real in ways the old ones never were, based on actual meeting between 2 authentic selves, rather than codependent merging between 2 false identities. The transformed empath also discovers their empathic gifts have evolved. They're not less empathic, they're more consciously empathic. They can perceive other people's emotional states with incredible accuracy, can understand psychological dynamics that others miss, can sense the unspoken truths in any situation. But they're no longer at the mercy of these perceptions, no longer pulled into every emotional frequency they encounter. They've developed what Jung called the observing ego, the part of consciousness that can witness without being consumed by what it witnesses. And this conscious empathy is far more valuable than the old absorption ever was. Because when you're not drowning in other people's emotions, you can actually help them, can offer clarity instead of just absorbing their confusion, can reflect their patterns back to them instead of taking those patterns on, can hold space for their transformation instead of trying to do their transformation for them. The old empathy was codependent. The new empathy is clean, clear, boundaried, and far more genuinely helpful because it comes from wholeness rather than depletion. If you're in the dark night right now, if you're experiencing the flooding, the shadow material surfacing, the collapse of your empathic identity, Jung would tell you this. Don't run from it. Don't try to resurrect the old self. Don't fight the darkness by seeking light prematurely. This darkness is doing something you cannot do consciously. It's stripping away the absorbed material, releasing the accumulated shadow, destroying the false identity, creating space for your authentic self to emerge. The flooding that feels like it's destroying you is actually forcing you to stop absorbing, making absorption so painful you can't continue it unconsciously anymore. And yes, it's unbearable. Yes, it feels like you're losing your mind. But you're not losing your mind. You're losing your absorbed mind, the composite consciousness you constructed from everyone else's reality. And underneath it, there's something real waiting to be discovered. The shadow material that's surfacing, all the emotions you've carried for others, they have to come up before they can be released. Have to be seen before you can distinguish what's yours from what you absorbed. And the confrontation with this accumulated darkness is brutal, but it's not permanent. It's not who you are. It's what you've been carrying. And once you've seen it, acknowledged it, you can begin to let it go piece by piece until your psychic space belongs to you again. The ego death, the collapse of your empathic identity, it feels like annihilation, like you're disappearing completely. But you're not disappearing. The false you is disappearing. The absorbed composite is dying. And it has to die completely. Has to be destroyed so thoroughly that there's nothing left to reconstruct. Because only in that emptiness can your authentic self finally have room to emerge without being immediately buried under new absorption, new false identity, new ways of being that aren't actually yours. Stay in the darkness. Let the flooding continue until your system learns that absorption is no longer viable. Let the shadow surface until you've seen and released everything you've been carrying that isn't yours. Let the ego die until there's nothing left of the false identity you've been performing. And in the emptiness, in the silence after the destruction, wait for what emerges. It won't be dramatic, won't be obvious. Will just be small signals of authentic self, genuine boundaries that arise without effort, real preferences that don't need justification, true desires that belong to you rather than something you absorbed from others. Follow those signals even when they contradict everything your absorbed self wanted. Even when they lead away from the life you built for the false identity. Even when honoring them costs you relationships that only worked when you were merged. Because that's what the dark night is preparing you for. The courage to be who you actually are instead of who you've been absorbing into being. The capacity to choose yourself even when everyone else needs you to choose them. The strength to stand alone as an individual rather than remaining dissolved in the collective. That's what Jung meant by individuation. And for empaths, that individuation requires this darkness, this death, this absolute destruction of everything you've been so you can discover who you actually are underneath. The dark night is the birth canal, and you're being born, not into light, not yet. First, into this darkness where everything false is stripped away, where every borrowed identity is destroyed, where every absorbed belief is released, until all that's left is what's actually real, what's genuinely yours, what's been buried under the absorption your entire life, waiting for space to finally exist. This is the dark night of the chosen empath, chosen not because you're special, but because your consciousness has chosen transformation over comfortable stagnation, has chosen authentic wholeness over false connection, has chosen the death that precedes rebirth over the slow death of remaining absorbed. You didn't ask for this darkness, but you're in it now. And the only way out is through the flooding, through the shadow, through the ego death, until you emerge on the other side as something you've never been before. An empath who isn't destroyed by their empathy, a sensitive being who doesn't lose themselves in others' emotions, a whole person who can connect without dissolving. That's worth the darkness. Worth every unbearable moment of this descent. Because what dies in the dark night is what was never real. And what's born is who you've always been underneath everything you absorbed from everyone else. Finally free, finally whole, finally yourself.